Hi, would you like to hear about the 11 books I read in December? Hi, I'm Colleen Delaney. I talk about books and writing. Today I'm going to talk about the books I read in December. This is probably the longest I've waited to do a wrap up. So I was literally looking at these books like trying to remember main characters' names. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to talk about them, the order of which I read them. I pulled them up on Goodreads because I also read so many ebooks this month, which I don't usually do. And so when I don't like physically have the book in front of me, it's harder for me to remember like what to talk about. So we're going to do it in order, following my Goodreads, and I'm going to tell you about all of them. I used December to basically catch up on how far behind I was on Book of the Month, which was very, and read a ton of extremely short romance novellas on my Kindle, which had mixed results. And then a lot of books by Sophie Jordan, a lot. I read 3 books and a short story by Sophie Jordan. Let's just go ahead and get started. First up, I read Daughter of Mine by Megan Miranda, and I loved this thriller. I had felt this year in particular that I was just not vibing with a lot of the thrillers I was getting from Book of the Month, with the exception of Listen for the Lie, which I absolutely adored. But a lot of the thrillers I was getting this month, or this year, were just like not working for me. Daughter of Mine 100% did. Our narrator is Hazel Sharp, and her father, who is a detective, dies suddenly and bequeaths his house to her, which is a little bit uncomfortable because she has 2 older brothers who were his biological children and she was not his biological child. And then you get thrown into this mystery of the disappearance of her mother, and is there something crazy going on? There's this drought happening, and so the lake that they live by is slowly receding, and as it's receding, people are finding cars that have been stuck in there for a very long time, and it's creepy. I really enjoyed this a lot. I thought the setting was great. The twists and turns were really good in terms of like who's a bad guy, who's a good guy, all that. Loved it. Good job, Megan Miranda. That was a really fun thriller. Next, sticking with Book of the Month at the beginning of the month, trying to get everything done, I read The Wild Huntress by Emily Lloyd Jones. This was a YA, and I enjoyed it. I wouldn't say like I loved it. It definitely didn't have like Ruthless Vows took over my brain, felt like I was losing my mind. I was so obsessed with the characters, but I really enjoyed it. And I would truly recommend it to young adults who want fantasy, who don't want like all the crazy romance. Honestly, this felt like such a true YA fantasy to me because there is no spice because it's young adult. And the characters have some like romantic tension, but it's not sexual tension. It's just a little bit romantic tension. And I really enjoyed it. It's a retelling of the Mabinogion, which is like a Welsh collection of mythology, legends, folklore, kind of blends all 3 together. And it's about the wild hunt. We have 3 narrators, Branwen, Gwydion, and Peardery. I probably pronounced all of those wrong because they're Welsh names. Branwen is a huntress. Something happened to her when she was a baby. And so she can see like the Fae world, which most humans can't. And she makes a living hunting monsters. Gwydion is from a magical family that rules, but he's kind of like a trickster character. And he decides that he needs to get into the wild hunt, and he uses Branwen as his champion because he knows he won't survive it. And then Peardery is a prince who was a human prince kidnapped by a Fae creature, raised by a Fae creature, and then sent back to the human lands. And the 3 of them are in the wild hunt together, and they decide to join together to try to win. And it's really cool. I liked how the wild hunt worked. I liked the rules of the game. I liked the monsters. It was very enjoyable. I really liked it. Then I gave myself a little bit of a break of Book of the Month, and I read All the Ways to Ruin a Rogue by Sophie Jordan, which is the last book in the Debutante Files. So I'm currently almost done with the first one. It's going to be on my January wrap up, and I also read the middle one in December, which I'll get to at some point. Honestly, this was one of those very rare Sophie Jordans that doesn't work for me that well. We have Aurelia and Max, and now I'm reading them in the other books because they're main characters in the other books, and I'm understanding why I don't jive with them. It's like brother's best friend. So Aurelia's older brother's best friend. She was like in love with him when she was a teenager. He was coming to visit. She was probably like 15 and he was probably like 20. And she was so excited to see him because she's like finally like a woman-ish. She's 15, but like for the time period. And she's like, I have curves now, and look at me in my grown-up dress. And she goes to find him to sort of tell him she's in love with him, and he's screwing a maid. And so she gets so angry. She's an artist. She draws like a very crude cartoon of him, and then people end up finding it. And it's a very, very enemies to lovers, to the point where I didn't like them together. They were so cruel to each other that it kind of, like, I was kind of like, you guys shouldn't be together. You should get away from each other and never be together again. Which is, enemies to lovers is one of my least favorite tropes, because it's hard for me to make that trope work in my brain. Probably because I'm a Taurus, and if you ever cross me, I will never forgive you rest of my life. But then next, I reread In Bed with the Stable Master by Sophie Jordan. It was on sale, and I read that book for the first time. She put it out for free like April 2020, I think, as like a, here you go, world, when things were really tough. And it's technically in the Rogue Files, which is her series that I just finished. And I was like, I just want to reread it. It's such a fast read. It's probably like a 30-minute read. It's about the family in the Rogue Files, like the Duke's family, but it's about two of the servants. And I love it because it has one of my most favorite tropes, which is like such a micro trope. But I love caught in a storm or a snowstorm, stuck in an abandoned cottage together. That's like my favorite trope. I love it. I love when it happens. It's like the whole book, because it's so short. It's like stuck in a rainstorm. He goes and finds her. They're in an abandoned cottage. What's going to happen? Adored it. All the stars in the sky. So the next book I read was only 37 pages long. And there's quite a few on this. That's why I was able to read 11 books this month. There's quite a few like that this month. And it's called Rescued by the Mountain Man by Reagan Phillips. And it's the first book in the Lovers of Little Bend series. I'm going to be super honest. I don't remember it that well. It's about a woman who's like mountain climbing, or she's like hiking through the woods, and this mountain man comes and saves her, and they went to high school together, and then they're like in his cabin. Obviously it's 37 pages long. It's basically like, hey, how are you? Remember, let's go bang in your cabin. And I gave it 3 stars, is usually what I give my, like, this was really, really short and didn't blow me away. And I don't think I actually wrote a review. I did not. So it was fine for what I needed, which was something to read right before I went to bed. Okay, guess what I finally finished? The Ministry of Time by Kayleen Bradley. This took me forever to pick up and then also to read, because I read while reading this is part of the reason I got in bed with, I read it in bed with the Stable Master again and that Mountain Man book, because I was just having the hardest time reading this book. I just did not like this book. And I was trying to figure out why, and I think the reason is a couple-fold. One, I think the premise was cooler than the execution, which happens. Sometimes you have such a good idea, and the idea is so cool, but then like the execution of it kind of doesn't live up to the premise. That happens a lot. Secondly, I think that when you read a lot of romance, and there's a romance in a non-romance book, it's hard for a romance reader to buy it. There's a romance in this. I didn't buy it at all. Also, I think part of the reason is because I do read a lot of historical romance, that it was a little, okay, so it's hard to read a romance, a historical romance about a realistic historical figure. Like, why would she be into him? Why would he be into her? It was very weird. Like, I thought their relationship just like didn't work for me, which is a big part of it. I skimmed a lot of this book, so the actual like science fiction behind the time travel became kind of muddy in my brain because I wasn't reading very carefully, because honestly, about 100 pages in, I knew I didn't like this book. But I already DNF'd one book of the month this year, and I really try to keep it at 1. Sometimes it's 2. Sometimes I can't help it and it's 2. But I was like, I can push through. I can finish this book. I just really didn't enjoy my time with it. I'm also not a big sci-fi reader. If I'm being completely honest, I read maybe 1 a year. And I did read a lot of reviews though, and feel like a lot of people felt this way, the same way as me. It just missed a lot of marks. There were some character deaths that were supposed to be so heartbreaking, but like, I didn't really care. I had a hard time caring about the characters, which is what it is. I mean, so many people bought this book this year. So after that, I read The Wood at Midwinter by Susanna Clark, which is kind of a weird read. So it is, I don't even know if there's page numbers. So it was, when you look at it, you're like, oh, it's 60 pages long. But the afterword is 11 pages, and which is a lot when it's only 60 pages. And the majority of the pages only have this much text. So this is a picture book. It's not a novella. Some people were saying it's a short story. I wouldn't even call it a short story. I think the word count in this is similar to what you would find in a picture book that you would read to a child, a preschooler. Like that's about as many words. So some of the pages have a bit of text on them, but like the first couple pages are thick, but then you get into the story and it's much less on each page. I read this book in about 15-ish minutes and I thought it was fine. I was thinking this was going to be a book that I was going to reread every Christmas, that it was going to be so wintry. It's beautiful. I am going to use it as a Christmas decoration. I talked to my friend who loves Susanna Clark, and she really enjoyed it. But she said that if you hadn't read Mr. Strange and Dr. Norrell, Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell, Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell, I think is what it is. She said she could see it being not as enjoyable because it felt like a piece of that book, which I did not read that book. This is my first Susanna Clark. I think if you love Susanna Clark, you'd probably like this. If you've never read anything before, like me, I don't know. But it's pretty, and I'm going to put it up on my mantle right there as decor for January. After that, I read How the Duke Stole Christmas, which is a collection of romance novellas by Tessa Dare, Sarah McLean, Sophie Jordan, and Joanna Shoup. So it's they were probably all like 100 pages-ish, maybe like 125 pages. 4 romance novellas bundled together. Unsurprisingly, my favorites were Tessa Dare's and Sophie Jordan's because I love them. They're loosely connected by this like shortbread recipe that gets passed from family to family. Tessa Dare's is about a woman who goes to a ball because she has to basically find someone wealthy to marry her to save her family because they're being evicted. And when she's there, she ends up meeting the man who's evicting them. And they have this like magical night walking around London together. It was adorable. Sarah McLean's was about childhood lovers who lived in townhouses next to each other and there was like a secret passage. But then like he became kind of like a Scrooge character, but it ends happily, obviously, later when she comes back into his life. Sophie Jordan's was my favorite. It's about a woman who's very quiet and she has a lot of really loud sisters, and she wakes up one morning and her family has left. They've like forgotten her because there's going to be like this horrible snowstorm and you're going to be snowed in till March, and they're in Scotland going back to London. So it's like Home Alone. And, but then the nearby Duke comes because there's like literal thieves going from house to house to like ransack. And so he comes to save the servants and then finds her and is like, oh my God, you have to come live with me for like 4 months. And so she does. And that was my favorite one. And then Joanna Shoup's was cute. I just didn't really like the hero as much. It's about a woman who is writing a like self-help sort of article in a newspaper. This is like the Gilded Age. And she's pretending to be this like wealthy married woman who has all this good advice because her mom's a servant. So her mom can tell her like everything about like how to throw a party and how to get stains out of your clothes, whatever, like that kind of stuff. And her like boss, her manager, who's the only person who knows her true identity, gets fired. And then the owner of the paper is like, we need to save the paper. You're going to throw a party for the investors at your beautiful townhouse with your husband. And she's like, I don't have those things. But she doesn't tell him, and she decides to try to throw a party anyways in a townhouse that's for sale. And it was very cute. Just he was very pushy, which I didn't like very much. Rest of the month was all romance. I have nothing but romance from now on. So the next one I read was Longing for the Mountain Man. And this was another one. I'm looking up the exact page count. This is 43 pages. It's by Lila Hart. It's #1 in the Rosewood Ridge Heroes. I had a lot of issues with this. I gave it 3 stars because like when you're reading a 43 page, I don't even like calling that a novella, like novelette. It's usually the word I like to use, novelette, but like I also feel like my accent sounds horrible when I say novelette. So I don't like to use that word, but this is about a woman who's like works for an insurance company, and she comes to a town after a tornado and she meets a man, and literally she's like 23 years old. They talk like 3 times, and then it's been like a couple days since they've met, and he's gone out of town for part of it, and they sleep together in like an empty conference room. I might be confusing that with another book I read that month, but it's literally like, we just met, I'm 23, I'm a virgin, let's have public sex, let's make a baby. And I couldn't, it was like too much. It's too much. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Girl, do not get knocked up by that man you just met. So that was hard for me. But the writing style was fine and like all that. And then after that, I read Rugged Mountain Man, a steamy, curvy girl romance by Kelsey Calloway. And this one was 78 pages. And I did give this 2 stars for a glaring reason. One, I didn't really like the story. But the second thing was, it was really obvious that the author had used find and replace for all the names. So it had originally been written with all different character names. And you could find it because like the main character, the premise is that the main character gets like left by her fiance, like a week before the wedding. She still goes on their honeymoon to Colorado, and she meets a guy in Colorado. But her ex's name was Liam. But so there were like words like handy that ended with A-N-D-Y, and it would be like H Liam. So you could tell she just did find and replace and then didn't read the book after doing find and replace. And then when I read some reviews, people were like, she repackaged this. This was a book she already wrote and then repackaged the names, which as an author, don't do that. Don't do that. The last book I read in December was An Heiress for All Seasons by Sophie Jordan. This is the Christmas novella in the Debutante Files. So that book I talked about at the beginning, which I can't see now. All the Ways to Ruin a Rogue was the last book in the series. This is the middle book. I'm almost done reading the first book. This does have one of my favorite tropes. Girl walks out in a snowstorm, man saves her. We're in a cottage together. I just like love that. I don't know. I love that trope. So I enjoyed this one a lot more than the other one. I will say overall, as I'm almost done with the third book that I'm reading in the series, the first book in the series, that this definitely isn't my favorite Sophie Jordan series. It's one of her older series, and I do think she sort of refined her voice more as she's gone on. But out of the 3, this one was my favorite because it has my favorite trope. Let's get caught in a snowstorm and find an abandoned cottage. How fun. And those are the 11 books. I feel weird saying I read 11 books because several of them were like 40 whatever page. 3 of them were like 40 page novellas, or 2 of them. But then I did read that collection of romance novellas that was really probably more like 2 books instead of 1, whatever. On my Goodreads, it was 11 books. So if you read any of these, please let me know. I'm just looking over my list right now. I think my only brand new books I read in December was Daughter of Mine and The Wood at Midwinter. Wild Hunters came out in October, so that was pretty recent. A Ministry of Time was not recent because it came out in May. I can't remember if I got that in May. I think May. I also read, I told myself I was gonna be better about this. Hold on one second. I also read 172 pages of The Secret History, and I am planning to slowly read this over the next 2-ish months because it has very long chapters, which I don't love. What I will say of the first 172 pages is that it is beautifully written. It's beautifully written, but it's very dense. It's one of those lit fics that's very dense and it's very long, so it is going to take me a really long time to read it. I can tell already that I'm not going to be one of those people, unless it really turns around in the second half, who's like, this is the best book I've ever read. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. It's a slow read. I'm not a huge fan of slow-paced books, but maybe the second half will not be slow-paced. It's also one of those books where, like, you know at the beginning's the exact person who's going to get killed. And so it's kind of weird when you're reading it. And I am interested. I thought it was going to go one way. They just kind of like explained the motive, what the motive is. And I definitely thought the motive was going to be something else. And I have to remind myself that this book came out in the 90s. So while I could see a book set in the 90s having what I thought was going to happen, it probably isn't as realistic that a book would have come out in the 90s, what I thought was going to happen. After I finish reading this, I will probably do an entire video about it, and it'll be all spoilers so that I can talk about it with other people. Okay, thanks for watching this pretty long December wrap up. What was the best book you read in December? Did you read something wonderful? Did you read any of those 40-page Mountain Man books that I read, or any Christmas romance, or any just wonderful Christmas? Or did you read The Wood at Midwinter? That's another one that I feel like maybe a lot of people read this month. Whatever, let's talk about it in the comments. If you made it this far and you don't want to write words, I'll take a snowflake because we finally have a lot of snow, even though we had barely any in December. We got like an inch, and then the next day was like 40 degrees and it all melted. So now that we're in January, where I live at least, January is our snowy month. So looks like Christmas outside now, even though that time has passed. I hope you are cozy, and as always, I hope you're in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. I'll see you soon.